I wanted to do one more video before we jump into some particular equivalencies in propositional logic, and that's to note that, generally speaking, if we're going to take one proposition and derive an equivalency thereof, we've just engaged in a immediate inference. And this contrasts with a so-called mediate inference. For example, modus ponens is a mediate inference. First premise, if P then Q. Second premise, P is the case, and then from those two premises, we're able to derive our conclusion that therefore Q is the case. And we have moved from the premises to our conclusion. That's how a mediate inference always works. However, we cannot go the other way around. That is to say, we cannot take just our conclusion and then derive our premises. It's only premises to conclusion. On the other hand, in a immediate inference, we can go both ways, so to speak. So if we have this proposition, whatever it happens to be, and we say that it is equivalent, logically equivalent to this proposition, where these three bars means logically equivalent to, we can move from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, and likewise from the right-hand side to the left-hand side, without any problem whatsoever. So if we have a premise, such and such, and we're able to immediately infer such and such, where this proposition here and this proposition here are logically equivalent, we can go both ways, from the premise to the so-called conclusion, and from the conclusion to the so-called premise. Well, actually, let me do a easy example. Let's say we have P is the premise and the conclusion is not P. So that's just a double negation. So these two statements, P and not P, are logically equivalent. So we can go both ways, premise to the conclusion, conclusion to the premise. Now, why note this? There's actually a few different reasons, but here I want to focus on what's called informal logic. It's a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's actually really helpful and really useful. So let's say you're in a debate with someone and you have X as the premise. So that's the evidence. And then you conclude that therefore X is the case. So that is our conclusion. The question is this a good argument? Now, formally, in a way, it does make sense, right? If X is the case, then indeed X is the case. And in formal logic, in mathematical logic, this is a good argument. It would have to be. We really have, in formal logic, the principle of identity. X is identical to itself. So if X is a premise, in a conclusion, X would also be true. So if X is true as a premise, it will be true as a conclusion. But informally, it is invalid, because here we're engaged in a debate, and the question is X true, or is it false? So we're debating about the truth or otherwise of X, and we can't just assume it as true in the debate. So if X is the conclusion, we can't assume it as true as a premise. Here we have the Petitio Principii fallacy, that is, begging the question. Now, to beg the question doesn't mean to raise the question. So those are two different expressions. So oftentimes we hear various pundits confuse these terms. For example, if there's an elephant in my room, I would say that raises the question of how the heck did it get there? But I wouldn't say it begs the question. I would just say it raises the question, because begs the question technically means to assume that which is under dispute, to assume that which is under debate, and that's a fallacy. It's a logical fallacy. Now, of course, in ordinary debates, it's not so obvious that a Petitio Principii fallacy has occurred. Rarely do we say, my conclusion is X, and I'm just going to assume X is true as the premise. We don't say, my evidence is X, my premise is X, my conclusion is X. Rather, we have something like, the premise is A, and the conclusion is B. So they're different. However, it turns out that A is logically equivalent to B. And if that's the case, we do have a fallacy. So therefore, recognizing logical equivalencies, recognizing immediate inferences, allows you to see, at least in many cases, if somebody is engaged in the Petitio Principii fallacy. You can spot circular arguments. So the premise and the conclusion might be stated a bit differently, but when you look at what they actually say, they have the same exact content. So let's think about a few examples here. These two first examples are pretty simple and pretty obvious. So if I say, God does not exist because he does not exist. So that's begging the question, because really, he does not exist, and he refers to God, is the same thing as saying he does not exist here. God does not exist because God does not exist. begging the question. It's assuming that which is under dispute. And likewise, if we have the Bible as the Word of God because it is divinely inspired, well, to be divinely inspired is really just to say the Bible is the Word of God. Once again, we have the Petitio Principii fallacy. How about this one? It is true that men are mortal because it is not the case that men are not mortal. Well, we have a double negation there. So before we had, with God does not exist because he does not exist, we really had X as a premise, X as the conclusion, but here we have M as our premise and our pardon me. I'm sorry. We have the because as the premise, so not M, conclusion M. But these two are logically equivalent, that's why it's begging the question. So the premise is the because part. It is not the case that men are not mortal, not M. Therefore, it is true that men are mortal, begging the question. Here's something a bit more tricky. If it is raining, then it's cloudy, because if it's not cloudy, then it's not raining. That's begging the question once again because we have an equivalency. This is a contraposition. Okay, so if you have if P then Q, this is actually logically equivalent to if not Q, then not P. So because there's a logical equivalency there, we have a Petitio Principii fallacy. So as you can see, knowing immediate inferences, knowing logical equivalencies is helpful in spotting fallacies.